It began, as most stories of transformation do, not with a grand decision, but with a quiet, almost accidental moment. Elias had moved to Japan to escape something he couldn't quite name. Maybe it was the monotony of his old life, or maybe it was himself. He told his friends back home he was there to find clarity, to snowboard, to travel, to live differently for a while. But deep down, what he was really searching for was peace. He rented a small room in a shared house near Nagano, a house filled with strangers, each from a different corner of the world. It was noisy, unpredictable, and alive in a way Elias wasn't used to. He had always lived quietly, the kind of person who overthought every word before saying it, who replayed conversations at night, worrying he might have said something wrong. And in a house with 40 strangers, there was a lot to overthink. Every laugh in the kitchen, every side glance, every ignored greeting felt like a referendum on his worth. He was kind, thoughtful, and eager to connect. But beneath it all, he was terrified of being disliked. He didn't know it then, but this fear, this constant need to manage how others saw him, was the invisible string pulling the puppet of his life. Elias believed that peace came from control. Control over his image, control over his outcomes, control over the way others thought and felt about him. But Japan had a way of humbling people who tried to control too much. He was surrounded by people who seemed effortlessly authentic, drinking beer on the porch, laughing too loudly, playing music at midnight. They didn't seem to care who approved, and for the first time Elias wondered, what would it feel like to stop caring too? That night, as he lay awake listening to the hum of late-night chatter, a thought crossed his mind, quiet, almost reluctant. Maybe freedom isn't about being in control. Maybe it's about letting go. He didn't know what that meant yet, but soon life would make sure he learned. Elias had always been the kind of person who tried to do everything right. When he was younger, he believed that if he was kind enough, responsible enough, and thoughtful enough, people would like him. Teachers, friends, lovers. He built his identity around their approval. But the older he got, the more exhausting it became. He'd craft every sentence like a PR statement. He'd second-guess jokes, emotions, even silences. Whenever someone seemed distant, he'd spiral into analysis. Did I do something wrong? Did I say too much? Should I have said less? This obsession wasn't about vanity, it was about safety. Because for Elias, approval meant belonging, and belonging meant control over rejection. But control, he would learn, was a fragile illusion. In Japan, that illusion began to crack. Living in a house full of strangers exposed him to chaos he couldn't manage, unwashed dishes, loud arguments, unpredictable moods. The more he tried to control harmony, the more frustrated he became. He started noticing the subtle ways people do this, the ways we all do, pretending to agree just to avoid tension, over-explaining ourselves so others won't misunderstand, trying to fix people who never asked to be fixed. Control doesn't always look aggressive. Sometimes it wears the face of kindness. Think about it. He wasn't trying to manipulate anyone. He just didn't know how to exist without trying to be understood. But there's a quiet tragedy in that, because the moment we start performing for others' approval, we lose ourselves in the role. Elias began to see how control had infiltrated everything. He controlled his words to avoid rejection. He controlled his silence to avoid conflict. He controlled his image so others wouldn't think he was lost. But control, by its nature, is rooted in fear. Fear that without it, the world will fall apart. One evening, while sitting on the balcony, he watched the snowfall blanketing the rooftops. The city was silent, untouched. For the first time in weeks, he felt calm. Not because he had done anything, but because he had finally stopped trying to do everything. And in that stillness, he began to wonder, what if control is the very thing that keeps me from peace? He didn't yet have the answer, but life was about to give him one. It happened by accident, as most awakenings do. Elias had stumbled into a small cafe on a quiet street near the edge of town. It was the kind of place where time seemed to slow down. Wooden beams, the faint smell of roasted coffee, a single man behind the counter who looked like he'd seen everything. His name was Sato. Sato was in his 60s, a retired school teacher who now ran the cafe with a sense of deliberate calm. He moved slowly, spoke softly, and somehow managed to make silence feel comfortable. Elias found himself going there often, not for the coffee, though it was good, but for the peace. One day, after a particularly frustrating morning at the shared house, a roommate argument over chores, a misunderstanding that spiraled, Elias vented to Sato. He spoke about how people should act, how they should understand each other, how he just wanted things to go smoothly. Sato listened quietly, then smiled. He placed a cup in front of Elias and said, "You speak as if everyone's life belongs to you." Elias frowned. "What do you mean?" Sato leaned on the counter. "You worry about what they think, what they feel, what they do. But those are their tasks, not yours." Elias tilted his head. "Their tasks?" "Yes," Sato said simply. "There are things in life that are yours to carry and things that are not." Peace comes from knowing the difference, Elias wanted to argue. The idea sounded too detached, too cold, but something about it lingered. Over the next few days, those words echoed in his mind. There are things that are yours to carry, and things that are not. When a friend ignored his message, he noticed his urge to chase. When someone disagreed, he felt the reflex to defend. And in each moment, he saw it. The invisible tug-of-war between what he could control and what he couldn't. Sato's lesson was beginning to take root, quietly reshaping how Elias saw the world. He realized that his suffering was never about what others did. It was about his endless attempt to manage what wasn't his to manage. Days passed, and Elias found himself returning again and again to that cafe. It became a sanctuary, a place where he could think without interruption, where words didn't have to fill every silence. Sato rarely spoke much, but when he did, it was the kind of talk that burrowed into your mind and refused to leave. One afternoon, Elias asked, "How do you know what's yours to carry, and what isn't?" Sato looked at him and said, "By watching your suffering." Elias blinked. "What do you mean?" "When you suffer," Sato said, "ask yourself, am I suffering because of something within my control, or because I'm trying to control what isn't?" He paused, letting the idea hang in the air. "If it's not yours, let it go. Life doesn't want you to hold what doesn't belong to you." Elias sat with that for a long moment. He thought about the hundreds of times he'd obsessed over other people's opinions, how he'd twisted himself into shapes to appear likable, to be safe, to be understood. He thought about how much of his life had been lived as a performance for an invisible audience, and suddenly he saw it clearly. The web of control he'd been spinning all his life. It wasn't just about people, it was about everything. He wanted control over how the world saw him, control over what his future would look like, control over whether he'd ever truly belong. But control is a trick the mind plays to hide from its own vulnerability. We chase it because uncertainty terrifies us. We think if we can predict outcomes, we can protect ourselves from pain. But in doing so, we end up imprisoned by our own expectations. You see, the tighter we hold the reins, the less we can feel the rhythm of the horse. Elias began noticing this everywhere, in others, and in himself. People weren't cruel because they wanted to be. They were controlling because they were afraid of rejection, afraid of losing love, afraid of failure, of chaos, of the unpredictable nature of being human. But fear, disguised as control, can never create peace. It only creates tension, the tension of constantly managing life instead of living it. He remembered something Sato had said earlier. Peace isn't something you earn. It's what's left when you stop trying to control everything. For the first time, Elias understood. Acceptance wasn't passive. It wasn't giving up. It was choosing to live without resistance. To accept that people will misunderstand you. To accept that not everyone will like you. To accept that life doesn't owe you the version of reality you wish for. It sounded simple, but it was one of the hardest things he'd ever tried to do. Because control wasn't just a habit, it was an identity. Letting go meant dismantling everything he thought kept him safe. And yet, he was ready. Elias began small. He started by noticing, just noticing, when he felt that urge to control, when he caught himself rehearsing conversations in his head, when he started predicting how others would react, when he explained too much, apologized too quickly, or offered advice no one had asked for. Each time he'd stop himself and ask, "Is this mine to carry?" And almost every time the answer was no. He began to feel something strange, not comfort, but lightness. The more he released, the more energy he reclaimed. One night, one of his housemates confronted him. Apparently, someone had found one of his YouTube videos, a small channel he'd been quietly building, a space where he talked about philosophy, growth, and self-awareness. They laughed about it, not cruelly, but with that tone that says, "You're weird for doing this." The old Elias would have panicked, deleted the video, hidden the project, made a joke to smooth it over. But now he didn't. He simply smiled and said, "Yeah, that's me. I make videos about ideas I'm trying to understand." And then he left it at that. No defending, no explaining, no justification, because their opinions weren't his to carry. Later that night, as he walked home from the convenience store, the cold winter air biting at his cheeks, he realized something. He hadn't felt the usual anxiety. He hadn't spent the night replaying the conversation or wondering what they thought of him. He just let it be. And it was liberating. Just like letting go isn't indifference. It's trust. Trust that you'll be okay, even if others don't understand you. Another lesson came a week later, on the slopes. Elias had gone snowboarding with a small group from the house. He'd always prided himself on being good, maybe even one of the better ones. But that day he fell, hard. He twisted his ankle and had to limp back down while everyone else kept going. He felt embarrassed, frustrated, small. But as he sat there, watching the snow drift quietly across the mountain, he thought back to Sato's words. Peace comes from knowing what's yours to carry. The fall wasn't his failure, his body, his effort. Those were his tasks. But how others saw his fall, whether they laughed or pitied him, that wasn't his burden to bear. And just like that, the shame evaporated. In its place came something softer, humility, perhaps. He began to see how much of life's suffering is self-inflicted, born not from what happens to us, but from our insistence on managing what doesn't belong to us. Elias started applying this principle everywhere. When someone ignored him, he let them. When plans fell through, he adapted. When people didn't meet his expectations, he stopped trying to fix them. It wasn't that he stopped caring. It was that he finally understood caring and control were not the same thing. He understood. To love someone is not to manage them. It's to witness them, and witnessing required space. Space for others to be themselves, and space for him to do the same. As the weeks passed, people began noticing something different about him. He seemed calmer, more grounded, more himself. But the irony was, he wasn't trying to be anything. He was simply being. He stopped performing, and the world didn't collapse. It simply met him as he was. Winter turned to early spring, and Japan began to bloom. The once barren trees outside the cafe where Elias often sat were now dressed in soft pink petals. The cherry blossoms arrived quietly, and yet, when they came, everything seemed to change. He'd been in Japan for months now. The stillness that once felt foreign had become something like home. One evening, as the last light of day faded behind the hills, Sato joined him on a bench outside the cafe. They watched the petals fall onto the river's surface. "You've changed," Sato said simply. Elias smiled faintly. "I think I've just stopped trying so hard to be someone." "That's what change looks like," Sato replied, "when you stop forcing the river to flow faster." The silence between them was soft, alive. Elias looked at the drifting blossoms and said, "It's strange. I used to think freedom meant having control. Now I think it's the opposite, because control is fear," Sato said, "and freedom is trust." That sentence hit him like a quiet revelation. He realized that most of his life had been lived in tension. The constant need to prove, explain, justify, to manipulate outcomes before they could hurt him. He had confused control with safety, and safety with peace. But peace had never been about safety. It was about surrender, not to others, but to reality itself. The truth was, life had never owed him understanding. People didn't have to see his worth for it to exist. The world didn't have to go his way for it to be meaningful. Because when you stop needing everything to make sense, life starts to feel real again. He remembered one of Sato's earliest lessons about the arrow and the wind. Sato had said, "You are the archer and the arrow. Your duty is to aim well. But the wind will always be outside your control." For the first time, Elias understood what that meant. All this time, he'd been fighting the wind, blaming it for moving him off course, when, in truth, the wind was never the enemy. It was the teacher. That night, Elias walked home along the narrow streets of the town. The lanterns swayed gently above him, their warm light glowing against the cool air. He noticed how the world moved, perfectly, effortlessly, without needing his input. The cats that darted between alleys, the quiet hum of traffic from the main road, the river's eternal flow. Everything was alive, in motion, without control. And yet, it all worked. Maybe that was what acceptance really was, trusting the intelligence of existence itself. That realization brought tears to his eyes. For so long he had thought enlightenment was some dramatic awakening, a moment of absolute clarity. But now he saw it was something simpler. It was peace in the middle of chaos, stillness in motion, letting life happen without needing it to obey. And in that surrender, something beautiful returned to him, his curiosity. He began creating again. He wrote, filmed, reflected. Not for validation this time, but because it felt honest. His videos became quiet letters, not to convince, but to share. And in that honesty, people listened. The irony was almost poetic. By letting go of control, his words began to reach more people than ever before. But this time, he didn't measure success by views or likes. He measured it by alignment, by whether what he said still felt true when no one was watching. Months later, Elias visited the sea. It was early morning, the horizon painted in gold and pale blue. He stood barefoot on the sand, the tide brushing against his feet. There was a kind of sacred quiet there, not the absence of sound, but the presence of something deeper. He thought about how much he'd tried to grasp, the people he wanted to keep, the outcomes he wanted to shape, the version of himself he'd been desperate to become. He realized he'd been holding life like a closed fist, tight, fearful, controlling, and that the moment he'd loosened his grip, everything began to breathe again, just like how the saying goes, "You cannot control the tide, but you can learn to stand in it, unafraid of what it carries away." The world hadn't changed. People were still unpredictable. Pain still came. Uncertainty still existed. But his relationship to it had changed completely. Because letting go doesn't mean abandoning effort. It means releasing attachment to results. It means saying, "I will give my best, but I will not demand that the world gives me what I imagine in return." And that is freedom. That is peace. Because when you stop trying to control the uncontrollable, something incredible happens. You rediscover your capacity for wonder. You start noticing small things again. The way sunlight catches in a window, the laughter of strangers, the strange miracle of simply being alive. Elias took a deep breath, the ocean air filling his lungs. He smiled, not because everything was perfect, but because it didn't have to be. He finally understood what Sato had meant when he said, "Life doesn't need your control. It only needs your attention." And in that moment, he gave it, fully. He watched as the waves erased his footprints one by one, and for the first time in his life, he felt no resistance, just gratitude. Most of us spend our lives trying to hold everything together, our image, our relationships, our future. But the truth is, what is meant for you doesn't need to be gripped. It will stay, not because you force it to, but because you are aligned with it. So, maybe the question isn't, how do I take control of my life? Maybe it's, what am I willing to release so life can finally breathe through me? If this story of Elias and his journey through control, surrender, and acceptance spoke to you, take a moment to reflect before you leave. Ask yourself, what are you still trying to control that's never truly been yours? And if you found meaning in this reflection, consider subscribing to this channel. Because here we don't just talk about philosophy, we explore what it feels like to live it. One thought, one story, one breath at a time.